Hello and welcome to my easy to understand guide to Spectre and industry. This could come up on Component 1 GCSE Media Studies on the EDUCAS exam board. The poster might appear in Section A for media language or representation question, but this video is going to focus on industry for Spectre, which will only be in Section B of that Component 1 exam. So for the industry style questions, you're going to need to have quite a lot of factual knowledge about Spectre, the companies that made it, the finance, the marketing. There's quite a lot of information to know. So I would suggest things like flashcards or making your own revision posters or fact sheets might be quite useful, but there are also official fact sheets by EDUCAS available on their website too. So one of the first things I would suggest knowing for Spectre in terms of industry is that the production company that primarily made it was called Eon Productions. Now, Eon Productions are quite a small British independent production company. They are not horizontally or vertically integrated into other companies in any way, and they mainly have only ever really made James Bond films. So they have limited resources in terms of their own facilities and their own money, which is probably why they had to join up with another company in order to make Spectre and other James Bond movies. Eon Productions had to work with Sony Pictures and MGM in order to produce and market and distribute the film to a global audience. So if you're talking about ownership, Eon Productions on its own just physically isn't capable of doing all of that without joining up and co-producing the film with other much larger companies. Now, Sony and MGM are conglomerates. They're major globally recognised companies that are vertically and horizontally integrated, and that will give them the resources, the money, the funding, the staff in order to make a big budget film like Spectre. The film itself cost £245 million to make, which is a huge amount of money. But if you've seen the film, and I suggest you maybe have a look at a couple of scenes from the film just to give you some context, they have spent a lot of that money on casting famous people, on massive set pieces in different countries, flying all over the world, action sequences, cars, technology, and a huge amount of stunts and special effects. So when you are involved with big, vertically and horizontally integrated conglomerates, it can give you the funding and the resources and the means to do all of those things that without them you wouldn't be able to. Even though the companies involved are quite big, it doesn't mean to say that sometimes they don't struggle financially. In previous years, MGM was actually on the verge of bankruptcy, and it got to the point where production on previous James Bond films was actually shut down temporarily because they couldn't afford to carry on. But luckily, other funders and other investors knew they were making a new James Bond film, knew it would make millions of dollars at the box office, and they gave MGM almost like a loan to cover the costs. And they made the money back at the box office, and they were able to continue production. So having and taking part in and producing these big budget films can actually be life or death for these companies, and can it mean that they are able to continue production because they will make so much money from these films that they can overcome financial hurdles that they might have faced. Spectre itself grossed over $800 million at the box office, and that's just cinema sales. That doesn't include things like DVDs, merchandise. So it has made a huge amount of money, and I think that's quite important to remember, that it is a very, very popular film that's part of a very popular franchise. Having big global companies like Sony and MGM involved in your production and distribution means that they are going to be able to help you to market and distribute your film to countries all over the world. And Spectre was exhibited and shown in many countries around the world, and that is because of those big companies that helped them. The money that Sony and MGM were able to put into marketing meant they were able to do a huge marketing campaign. There were multiple trailers. There were loads of different posters with different characters on them. They had social media pages. There was an official Spectre website as well as an official James Bond website. There were books. There was merchandise. There was a whole range of marketing materials that cost millions of dollars, but they knew that if they marketed it well enough, that it would make them more than enough money back at the box office to cover their costs of making the film. It might be a good idea to have a think about whether Spectre was a risky film for the companies to make or not, and what might have made it risky and what might have made it not risky, or a safer investment, if you like. So in terms of being quite a safe investment, you have got famous actors. Daniel Craig was very well known for being in other James Bond films by this point, and you also had people like Judi Dench in there as well, Naomi Harris. So there were lots of actors that would have been recognised both in Britain and in other countries as well. It was obviously part of an existing franchise, which brings with it a pre-sold audience, a guaranteed audience that is going to go and see that film regardless. It is based on a book, which many people will have read, by Ian Fleming, and that also brings with it perhaps a pre-sold audience of the author. It is made by companies or in conjunction with companies like Sony and MGM, who might have their old pre-sold audiences, their own fans of their other work, but it also means it gives them a certain air of quality, and it gives them a good reputation to be made by companies that are so big. It has a huge range of merchandise available for the film, and that reduces your risk because you know that's another avenue for you to make revenue or profit from. And they also had lots of opportunities for product placement within the film as well. Product placement is incredibly popular in films like this, and James Bond is very famous for doing these kind of product placement opportunities. So Aston Martin cars and types of alcohol and brands of shoe and watch and tie and all sorts of other things were advertised within the film. And actually, they made so much money from the product placement that they made half their costs back just from the product placement alone. That's before they'd even sold a ticket at the cinema. So product placement is a really important method used by production companies to earn more revenue. Technology for Spectre and the film industry is important. You know, over the last few years, we've developed so many technologies in film like 3D, IMAX, you know, really kind of high quality, high definition CGI, where it's incredibly realistic, you know, the use of green screen. And you will see this all the way throughout Spectre and its marketing materials. And even things like the IMAX features, they were advertised quite heavily on the posters and in the trailers. Because they know that that will engage many fans, particularly young male fans who are really interested often in sort of the latest technologies. So being able to use these technologies is because they have a high budget, and using those technologies then engages the audience and hopefully tries to guarantee more profit in the long run. The companies also used technology such as social media to promote the film and the franchise. So they used the hashtag Spectre online in a lot of their marketing materials and on their website as well to try and drum up interest into the film and to kind of create some anticipation within audiences. And don't forget, you know, social media is a global platform. So it means that you are getting your message and hopefully drawing in audiences from all over the world by using things like hashtags. You are going to need to know a little bit about film regulation for the industries section of the exam if Spectre comes up. Now, the film industry in Britain is regulated by the BBFC, the British Board of Film Classification, and they awarded Spectre in the cinemas a 12A certificate. You should know what a 12A certificate is. You should know how that compares to a 12, a PG, a U, a 15 and 18. So that's some research you might want to do in your own time. But you should probably be aware as to why it got a 12A and maybe why companies or why audiences complained and they thought that maybe 12A wasn't a good certificate for the film because Spectre was the most complained about film in the year that it was released. So I'm going to go through some of those things now. 12A certificate means that you can go into a British cinema if you are 12 and over on your own. If you are under 12, you have to be accompanied by an adult in order to go and see that film. So in theory, I could take my 3-year-old to go and see Spectre. If you've seen Spectre, you need to be aware of some of the scenes that might be unsuitable for young children. So for example, there are scenes of somebody having their eyes gouged. There is a scene where Bond is being tortured and there are kind of long needles being put into his ears and eyeballs. It's quite uncomfortable. You don't really see very much because obviously they were trying to make it as family friendly as possible, but it's kind of inferred violence and torture. There is a scene where somebody shoots themselves in the head. And, you know, there's lots of action scenes, lots of violence, punching, shooting, etc. There's also quite a lot of kind of implied sexual scenes between James Bond and some of the many women that he meets on his trips. And, you know, a lot of people felt that these scenes were not appropriate for a young audience. And so the BBFC received something like 144 complaints, which actually is not that much when you think about it in the whole of Britain, but it did make it the most complained about film of that year when it was released. And that's what people said, that they didn't think it was appropriate. All these scenes were not appropriate for a 12A certificate. The BBFC responded by saying that they had given them the 12-day certificate because they felt that the violence was not graphically shown and that the filmmakers had made several cuts to make the violence more acceptable. So, for example, the suicide scene had originally been shown on a close-up and the programme makers changed it to be seen on a kind of aerial shot, almost a very high-angle shot from behind, so you didn't really see very much at all. They also felt that the scenes where James Bond was being tortured were okay because in the BBFC's opinion, everyone knows that James Bond always lives. So in their mind, people wouldn't have been scared to watch it because they would know that he would survive. So they were the reasons why the BBFC said they'd awarded that 12A certificate. The BBFC are kind of moving towards a more liberal viewpoint on regulation, and they are hoping to get towards a position whereby audiences can take responsibility for knowing what's going to be in a film and whether or not they and their children would be okay watching it. So the BBFC are hoping that parents can take more responsibility, and that's potentially why they've got their own kind of special parenting BBFC website called BBFC Insight, and that is why where people can go and basically find out all the bad stuff that's in a film before they go and see it without seeing any spoilers, so that they can make their own judgments as to whether or not they and their children would be okay watching that film. But many people feel the BBFC could be doing more, and some people feel they should be doing more to protect audiences, particularly because there are so many young audiences who are fans of Bond films. Regulation is also quite difficult for companies like the BBFC and for production companies when a product is going to be distributed globally, because it might mean that you have to recut that film for different countries and what their rules and regulations are. The BBFC actually are quite tight in terms of their regulations. So in Britain, we have some of the strictest rules regarding film classification and regulation. Other countries might have more lenient rules. You might not be able to show any of the kind of sexual scenes in some countries. You might not be able to show, eye gouging in some countries. So a production company has to be quite prepared to recut that film, re-edit that film several times in order to meet the guidelines set by different countries if they want their film to be distributed in a global way. Of course, technology has made regulation of the film industry really difficult. For a start, we have piracy, where within seconds of a film being in a cinema, sometimes before it's even been in the cinema at all, the film is often available illegally on the internet, where anyone of any age can watch it with no restrictions. In addition, we also have things like streaming sites. So once a film has been released then on something like Netflix, or it's been shown on Channel 4 or on Sky, we can then stream that film straight to our homes with no one checking our ages, and we often can stream it at any time of the day, meaning it could be before the watershed when children are still awake. And so technology has made regulation of the film industry really quite difficult. So if Spectre comes up in the industry section of component 1, it will be as a stepped question. That means that it will be in several parts, some with smaller, shorter, maybe 1 or 2 mark answers required, maybe some with 4, 6 or 8 marks, and you'll probably get at least one question that is worth more marks, like 10 or 12 marks. So it's important to be able to answer very short questions like name the production company that makes Spectre, but it's also important to be able to answer longer questions such as how does the ownership of film industry affect the films they make. So you'd be looking at the companies and the impacts they have on Spectre. So you need to practice learning lots of factual information and hopefully trying to remember as many things as possible as you can about Spectre and the industry it falls into.